Before we begin tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Cadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we meet tonight. I'm particularly delighted tonight to welcome you back to the second in a series of events that we're doing with the Centre for Cultural Research at the University of Western Sydney. We often work with different universities or different cultural partners to bring events like tonight's to you. And I think there's no better place than the Museum of Sydney to listen to presentations that focus on working and playing in the city on the move, and the dangerous city. Over many years we've held conferences that focus on the city, whether it's the cultural economy or issues of housing or planning or living in the city. And tonight we turn our attention to Summer Night Reflections, the City After Dark. I'd particularly like to thank Professor David Rowe, the director of the centre, and the coordinator, Mari Neal. I don't know where you are, Mari. There you are, great, thank you. Mari O'Neill, sorry. And also Deborah Stevenson, who I welcome to the podium. She's the head of the School of Social Sciences at the University of Western Sydney. Welcome, Deborah. Thank you very much and enjoy tonight's talks.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hello and welcome. This, as Carolyn said, is the second of these events that the Centre for Cultural Research has conducted in association with the Museum of Sydney, and I think it's an association that we're very, very excited about, and I think that has a great deal of potential, and we thank the museum for their enthusiasm and continuing support for our work. The theme for tonight's event is the City After Dark. This is, as you all know, a highly topical and important issue. Today there's been a whole lot of discussion in the media about the Alco-Pops story, and it seems that every other day there is some story that relates to issues that are associated with the City After Dark. The activities that take place in any city after dark play a significant role in shaping the image and livability of that city, and contribute both positively and negatively to the urban economy and to local amenity. For local authorities, the challenge is to try and create after-hours urban spaces that are safe, welcoming and vibrant. These will be places that are used by a diverse range of people in a variety of different ways. Unfortunately, though, the lived reality of the city at night is often very different, and the city can be a place of public drunkenness, disorder and violence. There are two main bodies of thought that have been influential in explaining and informing both the development and regulation of what has become known as the nighttime economy. The first of these perspectives emphasises the need to stimulate nighttime urban leisure cultures and facilities, and to encourage people to live in the inner city. In other words, the aim is to create inner cities that are simultaneously places of work, home, leisure, creativity and imagination. The second view is a very different one, and it focuses on issues of regulation and increased surveillance and curfews and policing and controlling what goes on in the city after dark in order to make it a safe place for all urban users. Now, at the beginning of last year, I, along with my absent colleague David Rowe and Stephen Tomsen, secured funding from the Australian Research Council to explore this tension between the regulation and the stimulation of the nighttime economy. And we are embarking on the first major study of the nighttime economy that has been conducted in Australia. Focusing on Sydney, the research that we're doing builds on two pilot studies, one that was conducted in Parramatta and one in Newcastle. The study aims to undertake a comprehensive examination of the use, experience and governance of the nighttime cultures and spaces of Sydney. It addresses the competing uses of urban space, the levels of planning and regulation required to foster nighttime cultures and minimise alienation amongst different groups. And to this end, we're undertaking detailed observations in key nighttime economy sites, including Circular Quay, George Street, Darling Harbour, and the area around Oxford Street, Darlinghurst. We're also conducting a survey of users of the city at night, and this includes people who frequent the licensed premises, the people who run the licensed premises, the people who patrol the licensed premises, but also the people who live in the city and who experience the city as in a very different way from the people who use the city for pleasure. We're also looking at local and state regulations such as liquor licensing laws and examining the practices of policing and regulation that go on in Sydney in the evening. The research is now underway, and so we thought it was timely for us to talk a little bit about the project and some of its preliminary findings, as well as to discuss generally some of the key issues associated with the use and governance of the city at night. So to this end, the program for this evening is right up there. There'll be talks by Professor Stephen Tomsen from UWS, Mr. Nathaniel Bavinton from UWS, and Professor Rob Lynch from UWS, and there'll be some interludes presented by Philip Wadds, who's a PhD student working on the project, who's been conducting observations in the field, and so we'll hear some of his field notes and see some of the images. Then we'll have time for questions and a panel discussion after that. So, on that note, I shall welcome the first of our speakers, which is Professor Steve Tomsen. Steve is a Professor of Criminology at the University of Western Sydney. He's conducted extensive research over many years into a range of issues associated with the city at night, focusing in particular on violent crime, urban disorder and hate crime. So I'll hand over. Welcome.
Thanks. Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Deborah. I don't have a written paper that I'm going to speak to tonight. I just have some PowerPoint slides that I want to get through with some, and these are issues that I want to run through that necessarily reflect my own interests that, have been explained to you as my interest in violent crime and policing and security. So bear with me, please. Sydney as the dangerous city. Well, this city has this whole history of concern, anxiety about crime, disorder and violence, and this goes way back in our history. And there's been a strong association between the inner city of Sydney historically with great levels of violence. There have been different waves of moral panic through our history going back to colonial times. Panic between something you could call respectable opinion and worries that respectable citizens in this city have had about different sorts of groups like larrikins, razor gangs, drunken louts and so forth. In addition to that, there has been this regular worry about vice and criminality and disorder, and there's an association of the night with that in this city. This isn't just something which has been whipped up as an irrational moral panic. It's certainly been a real part of our history. So there have been a lot of eruptions in Sydney in the last 200 years, a lot of eruptions that have set off these worries, these concerns about disorder and drunkenness and debauchery and vice. A key example of moral panic in Sydney and debates about the respectable use of leisure would be what we have done over time with public drinking. The state in New South Wales has always had a very ambivalent, a very divided view about public drinking, and I actually think the underlying reason for that has always been that there's a need for social order, but at one and the same time, drinking has produced considerable amounts of revenue, and that's actually a division, an ambivalence, which is still running through the contemporary debates about venues and venue regulation at this moment. There has been a backdrop of concern about corruption, debates about unreliable monitoring, all the problems about reporting and recording of crime, which is still very, very significant to us. There has been a sort of historical compromise. You know, we began with a lot of drinking in convict Sydney, then we moved to temperance as a movement. We heavily regulated public drinking with the 6 o'clock swill, and then there was a type of liberalisation which began in the 1970s under Neville Wran, and that has actually continued till the present day, and we now have debates about very late hours and public drinking. What we have arrived at, though, that is more recent, is the idea of changing the way people drink rather than just controlling it. What we're doing now is we're debating about ways to shape public drinking. So what's happened with this is there's a move away from what I would call the chemical model or the pharmacological model of alcohol and drinking and disorder, the idea that certain people will inevitably become aggressive and engage in crime and disorder when they become intoxicated, is what you call the chemical model. But the literature, the research has moved on from that. We now have a good deal of ethnographic evidence from anthropologists about what is called drunken comportment, about the ways that people drink or even get heavily intoxicated. And these actually vary quite a bit between cultures and different sorts of social scenarios. We have first-hand studies of drinking venues. And some people here would know that I was, for example, one of the people doing that about 20 years ago in this city. I was actually doing a study of licensed venues a long time ago. And there's an association that has been found from that sort of ethnographic research between disorder in relation to drink and the social milieu of unfriendly, crowded, high noise and uncomfortable places with aggressive staff as well. This sort of knowledge, this background knowledge, is something which has set off more and more of these debates about shaping the social context of drinking. Another key discovery of this research, this ethnographic research, I would call it, is that disorder and violence is not necessarily the case, but we actually have to start looking at the gendered aspect of these social problems as well, that there are different styles of masculinity that are actually promoted in drinking culture, that are inscribed in drinking culture. And that's obvious from what are called the honour contests. The typical assaults, the typical fights that go on in the nighttime economy are actually disputes of some sort between typically two young intoxicated males having a dispute about respect or honour, which has got some sort of trivial basis to it. But these have greatly significant outcomes. This is what comprises most of the serious assaults and also the homicides that happen in these sorts of leisure settings as well. So we have now a new social model of drinking that we can use and we can look at. And there is the idea that we could mould drinking, that drinking and drinking disorder have a cultural aspect to them, and that varies and it could be changed. It's something that evolves. And for this reason, we now have all these debates about regulation, monitoring, liquor records, shaping the environment of drinking in different ways. Although, as most of you would know, monitoring and piecemeal change, tinkering at the edges, this is still something which is a source of great contention in this city at the moment. The nighttime economy, as Deborah explained, this refers to an expanding range of leisure consumption after dark, and all the associated activities and the services that go with that. This has held out great promise, particularly in the 1990s in the depressed former manufacturing capitals of North England. There was great hope that the nighttime economy would revive depressed cities, increase the spending and the employment in them. And in addition to this, the nighttime economy was regarded as a major part of tourism, the idea of city branding, the idea of a cosmopolitan image. Nighttime leisure is an essential part of that. People who are advocates of this look for a range of activities, things like dining, cinemas, concerts, theatres and major events, although the debate, as you would probably guess already, has become, to what extent can we actually create these? Can we foster these, or instead are we left with a monoculture of drinking and sometimes just aggressive drinking in the nighttime economy? Do we have any choice about fostering something other than that? So in Sydney, it's certainly the case that the nighttime economy as a drinking culture has grown. We have a massive growth of new outlets, particularly in places around Darling Harbour and even along George Street in the last 2 or 3 years, for example. And the establishment in this city of what some people would call al fresco drinking, or I would even myself call it pavilion drinking. That's my term for it when I actually go down to the opera bar. It's actually public drinking with some sort of spectacular view. You know, and the best view of the lot is the harbour. You know, it's a good way to drink, I think. I can see its attractions. And I actually think this city is starting to evolve its own style of drinking in the last few years. And we have a much more developed late night club scene as well. Again, the question though is, to what extent is this just going to be about drinking, the aggression that can come from drinking, and who gets excluded by this? As well as reflecting moral panic, nighttime leisure also does reflect reasonable concerns as well about risks of things like assaults, injury and robbery. And it actually does produce this need for intensified policing and surveillance, which has all sorts of mixed effects on how people experience public space and experience their leisure time as well. The officials, the statisticians in Sydney, the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research, they, you know, I trust their science. Their belief is there is no certain evidence that there's been a greatly increased level of violence in Sydney, as the media might claim in recent years, even though there are a lot of problems there with reporting and recording, something quite contentious. However, it is the case that people are assaulted in Sydney. There are spaces of danger, and a knowledge of these, whether it's rationally based or irrationally based, this actually informs people's choices about their leisure practices. And unfortunately, it also leads to the possibility that some people feel marginalised or excluded in their leisure choices as well. So, I've an overhead now, or a slide rather, that it draws that out for you very clearly. This is also from Boxar, from their reports. These are the alcohol-related assaults in 2007 in inner Sydney. What's interesting in that, you can see straight away, there are really no surprises, I think, but it's good to confirm. Can corroborate what people already suspected. You can see there's a distinct high level of assaults around mid-George Street. quite a bit around Haymarket, and I actually think there should be a purple patch there around where the tracks are concentrated around Central Station, as well as this link with drinking venues and entertainment. There's also the issue of transport hubs and assaults and risk around transport in Sydney at night as well. King's Cross really stands out, no surprises there. The other one that intrigues me though is if you actually look at Oxford Street, there's this sort of, that comet-shaped purple image there suggests that Oxford Street has a significant number of assaults, but they actually go up the closer you get to Taylor Square, and there's a real concentration just around Taylor Square as well. And this fits quite a bit with a lot of the anecdotal evidence that we're starting to hear from people about where they feel there's risk and danger at night time in Sydney, the sorts of places that they feel that, you know, they might avoid, or they feel quite inhibited in relation to. I won't spend much time on this. This is a map also for non-domestic assaults, and it corresponds almost exactly to the one you just saw for alcohol-related assaults. It's intriguing how close it is. So the point I would like to make is that fear can be inflated or it can be rational. We shouldn't be too dismissive of people who feel fearful in relation to nighttime leisure. Fear and what is even now called incivility in public space, a sort of low-level, nuanced type of hostility. This is something that is real to many, many people, and we shouldn't trivialise it. It relates to specific places and times, and it can exclude specific groups of people, and we need to know a lot more about that and how to remedy this situation. The leisure that we have late at night is quite masculine. It's about young, cashed up, heterosexual men. I mean, increasingly there are young women involved in the nighttime economy, but it's still quite masculine, this drinking culture. This is a domain of fear for a lot of women, even though the feminist campaigns focus on domestic violence. There are still many women who, you know, for good reason, they actually feel fearful about public space as well. And in Sydney, you've had a revived fear of hate crime. You know, the gay and lesbian community around Taylor Square have actually reignited the whole issue of hate crime, being subjected to violence and harassment in the last 2 years in that part of Sydney. And that actually has a lot to do with the new expansion of the nighttime culture, nighttime economy in that part of Sydney. So this idea that there are certain groups of people who are excluded, this is something we have to reflect on, because we would like to promote a sort of inclusive vision of urban culture, and we want to do that around nighttime leisure as well. And we really have to think about having all sexes and sexualities and all different groups of people from different ages and social classes, and how we can actually incorporate them and actually make them all feel welcome. I'll stop about now. I think perhaps this is my last slide. I should perhaps explain some of these pictures, what their meaning is. These are some of the casualties of nighttime leisure in Sydney. The one on the upper left is Paula Brown. Paula Brown was a hairdresser who went on a girls' night out on Oxford Street about 10 years ago, and she was killed by somebody she met in drinking venues while she was out having what began as a very good night out for her. The young man on the right is actually an assault victim named Craig Gee. He was actually attacked on Taylor Square about 2 years ago, and Surrey Hills Police were so unhelpful when he reported this. There was a furor. There was, you know, quite a change in Surrey Hills Command that actually came out of that. And this really sparked off, this really ignited the whole debate about hate crime around Darlinghurst and Taylor Square, the particular attack that he experienced. The picture below is him recovered with his partner a few months later. I'll leave it there, thanks.
Thank you. Time now for what is being termed a visual interlude. Philip Wadds, who I mentioned earlier, who's a PhD student working on the project, is actually ill. So via the magic of technology, and which I hope works, we shall get images and voice without Philip actually needing to do a thing. So...
The female was surrounded by a group of 4 of her friends who were hysterically attempting to answer the paramedics' questions whilst frantically talking through their mobile phones. The paramedics, attempting to encourage a response from the female, whose clothes were covered in vomit, calmly rolled the female into recovery position before talking through their radio to get a stretcher brought down. The masses of people who alighted from the train at the station, most of whom were already showing signs of intoxication, simply walked around the distressed party and continued on up to the Darlinghurst Road. Atop the escalator is your first glimpse of the neon highway that is Darlinghurst Road, the main artery of the notorious King's Cross Entertainment Precinct. Two large billboards at the exit to the train station warn nightgoers of the potential harms associated with binge drinking and drug consumption. This sentiment was almost entirely lost on a crowd of people converging on the most popular side of mass intoxication Sydney has to offer. Taking a quick moment to sit on the steps encircling the city edge of the harbour, I realised that they form a nice counterpoint to the ring of commercial sites that surround the harbour frontage. This is a true public space, accessible and not attached to any particular venue. There are people dotted all around the harbour. It encourages people to dwell in this space and to take advantage of the vista provided by the ring of brightly lit commercial sites and venues behind me that are kind of built on top of one another. The lighting right around the edge of the water at the base of every pier turns each into a gleaming column. Then, above these lights, both neon and normal, are the lights of the cafes, restaurants and bars in the area. Above these are the bigger buildings and institutions of Harbourside and the Convention Centre. Then the zigzag neon lights of the Novotel and the skyscrapers in the backdrop of the distance. And all of this light is reflected on this liquid canvas of the harbour. I'm sure in the day it's lovely too, but it shows an understanding that one of the pleasures of the night is to experience the ordinary city as a fantasy other.
Thank you. And we'll have another little sort of insight into Philip's nighttime activities in a little while. Our next speaker is Nathaniel Bavinton, who is a project officer at CCR working on this particular project, as well as a postgraduate student who's completing, at this very moment, a PhD on the nighttime economy in Newcastle. And Nathaniel's going to talk about City on the Move.
Thank you, Deborah. The key characteristics that make nightlife a fundamental cultural and economic asset in any city are safety, diversity and vitality. Yet there seems to be an uneasy fit between these values. One person's safe is another person's bland. Diversity inevitably brings difference, the spectre of an other, a fear most likely born of a lack of understanding, but on occasion through very real disparities in values and interests. A key issue in understanding nightlife is the movement of people through the nocturnal city. Mobility is central, but how do we conceptualise this mobility from understanding the complexity of urban nightlife, and how does the movement of people through the city enable different forms of nightlife to exist and also at the same time create sites of tension and conflict? The first thing we must grasp is that the city at night is a quite different place to the city at the day. This is obviously intuitively obvious to most of us. But Sydney after dark is much more than Sydney in the dark. It's a dynamic place in which a number of time-space layers produce definite and identifiable changes in the dominant practices, in the dominant participants, their geographies, their flows and their rhythms. Now this is true in regard to what actually happens, but also where it happens. Many of the centres of activity in the day do not automatically translate to become key centres of activity at the night. The quickest way to demonstrate this principle is to utilise the example of a park. Civic spaces of the day are frequently associated with green space. Parks, replete with symbols of nationhood, civic identity, hold a status as desired day sites. They offer public space for leisure, places of respite for workers, meeting points for friends, so on. What makes these green spaces desirable and well utilised in the day-centric city is exactly that which makes them often perceived as hazardous at night. Green space is routinely, almost unanimously identified in people's risk-based mental maps of the nocturnal city. So as day turns to night, the city undergoes a transformation. And in this, we often see a disconnect emerge between the locations of material arrangements that are conducive to dwelling and the positioning of lighting. Many public spaces are reduced to thoroughfare, lights tending to mark out routes between space rather than mark out places where people may like to meet and gather. I'm not suggesting the city be bathed in light. That does not appeal to someone who is attuned to the experience of night. But the significance of lighting in developing a sense of safe nocturnal environment cannot be overstated. The positioning of lighting is a powerful indicator, almost a determinant, of the routes people will take through the city and where they will spend their time. So the shift to night changes the key sites of the city. The sites of amenity tend to become limited to a few precincts in which consumption-based leisure activities are clustered. In the nocturnal city, public space is subordinate to commercial space. The dynamicism of the nocturnal city is not restricted to a simple day-night dichotomy, however. The key sites do not shift once at sunset and then remain stable throughout the evening. They continue shifting throughout the night. The broad nighttime economy, or the broad sense of nightlife, is fairly easily, although not unproblematically, distilled into three different time-space layers. From 9 to 11, we have what we might call the evening economy. From 11 to 2, the nighttime economy proper. And from 2 to 5, the late night or the deep night economy. The means for differentiating and distinguishing these layers lie in the interrelationship between amenity and cultural practice. That is, what services are available in a given space and what happens in that space accordingly. Now, I'm attempting to emphasise the complexity of nightlife in this talk, so and not try to reduce it to neat and arbitrary parcels. So both these labels and the time frames are only tools for discussing spatio-temporal segmentation of practices. They change according to place, they change according to the day of the week, and obviously structural factors such as zoning and licensing bear a significant impact. Literature and our own research does, however, indicate there is some significance to this spatio-temporal segmentation. So I'd like to demonstrate some of these issues through a quick analysis using an example of Circular Quay. Popular tourist nightlife mecca, Circular Quay is home to many of Sydney's iconic sites, amongst them the Opera House, the bridge and the ferries. This map depicts the locations of nightlife venues in and around Circular Quay between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. As can be seen, there's quite a number. Relatively diverse. The size of each circle represents the capacity, the popularity of a venue. The bigger the circle, the bigger the establishment. The different colours represent different types of licences. The pale orange circles represent drink and dine licences, predominantly restaurants. The green ellipses represent cultural institutions. Of those, we have the Opera House, the Museum for Contemporary Art on the City West, which is not open at this time, but sometimes plays host to events, and we have the Dandy Cinema on the eastern side. The bright orange circles represent venues whose licences dictate they shut at midnight. The red circles have a licence to stay open beyond midnight. And nestled in there is a 24-hour McDonald's. There's always a McDonald's. Now, within this time-space layer, this is the nightlife of the city imaging brochures, marketing campaigns, supported by city authorities for its capacity to convey a cultural sensibility. The evening economy is characterised by a comparatively extensive array of leisure options, a high degree of venue availability, as we all talk about, in terms of quantity and diversity. Large numbers of cafes and restaurants ply their trade, cinemas and theatres are well attended. Indeed, much scheduling of entertainment, such as plays, theatre, performance and exhibition openings, is organised around the understanding that a night out in the city is often underpinned by the popularity of social dining. The evening economy tends to come to a close at around 11 p.m, although this varies from place to place. At this time, the number of nightlife participants drops dramatically, and consequently services, particularly public transportation timetabling, it also becomes much less frequent. From 11, we witness a transition into a different type of nighttime economy. We see the closing of restaurants and cultural institutions and venues, they've all just vanished. The number and variety of venues is increasingly restricted. The clustering of venues becomes more pronounced, and as a result of that, the distance between lively spots stretches out. As a lot of public transport is finished or is winding up their services, there's also more pedestrian movement. At this point in time, taxi availability also tips into a condition of scarcity. Typically, there is a dramatic shift into alcohol-centric service provision. Now, most of the restaurants and those venues that had a drink and dine licence also make alcohol available. The difference is that the role of alcohol as the central functioning element of the consumption experience, as opposed to in a restaurant where it's kind of peripheral to a meal, or peripheral to a form of entertainment, a drink before a show, for example. The time series continues. We are now between 1 and 3 a.m. From about 2 a.m, venue availability is reduced again. This is a theme exacerbated by the lockouts of strategies of the current New South Wales government. The timing of those lockouts clearly indicates the perception that it is this late night economy that is the source of problematic behaviours. Certainly the majority of alcohol-related violence occurs at this time. Now, only one venue in this area is being targeted by the lockout laws, which is the Orient Hotel, which is marked up there by a target. One source of diversity does, however, emerge, and that's the introduction of nightclub cultures of consumption. These can be quite different, and they usually involve a different choice of intoxicant and slightly different ambiences, such as lighting and music, etc. So here we have the same time series, but in an abstract form, so that I can just make the homogenisation and the clustering more apparent. It should be noted that while venue availability creates conditions of clustering, this does not necessarily produce homogenisation, cultural homogenisation. These are all identified as homogenous because they are all highly alcocentric. I'll return to that point in a minute. In this slide, we return to an earlier theme, which is lighting. The encroaching dark is symbolised, and from what is a relatively well-lit region at 10 p.m, the areas of illumination decrease as venues close, shutting down their contributing radiance into the public space. At 3 a.m, quite the same situation as I just described earlier in relation to Hyde Park exists in the built environments of Circular Quay. The remaining well-lit regions come courtesy of public lighting surrounding the train station and the pedestrianised area at the front of McDonald's, which is still open. The train station, however, is non-functioning and is an empty place of foreboding and risk. As Stephen pointed out, risk and transport nodes are nearly synonymous at this time of night. The other well-lit strip extending from that is the taxi rank, which becomes a beacon attracting diverse people seeking a limited resource. Now at this time, that is 3 a.m, at taxi ranks we find one of the most notorious and un-Australian of creatures, the queue jumper, and problems can ensue because of that. Now, the once brightly illuminated cosmopolitan restaurant strips on either side of the quay are now dimly lit and sparsely populated. The area around the Opera House itself, up on the point, completely deserted. The intersection of George Street and Argyle Street on the left there This is the only well-lit and well-populated region in this whole area. It's heavily dominated by drunken and disorderly. Now, as mentioned, these venues are not necessarily homogenous. I mean, they're very similar, but not necessarily homogenous. The complexity of nightlife derives in many ways from the subtly different cultures of consumption that are occupying the same spaces simultaneously. Now, in this slide, I divide those venues that are open between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. along a fairly simplistic demarcation, but it's one that's sufficient to make my point. The traditional pub culture and the upmarket bar culture. Traditional, for those who maybe don't have a good angle, traditional pub culture is blue circles, upmarket bar culture, the more lavender circles. Now, all sorts of symbolic status, socio-economic and age distinctions are embodied in this cursory schism. They are aptly summarised, however, in two bar reviews that I stumbled upon by accident, which describe two venues associated with these. See if you can tell which is which. Yes, you've got to be careful with those beer goggles. All right, so now all of this is leading to this next slide. Don't be alarmed, it's not as complex as it looks. What we have here is the two aforementioned cultures of consumption and their principal directions of pedestrian flow. As the venues that cater for and enable these distinctive cultures of consumption have different licence types, predominantly we see the later opening venues playing host to the traditional pub culture, the more rowdy and rapid patterns of consumption, the vertical drinking, the more densely packed environments. So these flows are not necessarily happening at the same time. For example, the flow away from the Opera House, which is at that point up there obviously, is complete by 1 a.m. because there's nothing open out there beyond 12 a.m. However, this big blue flow to the taxi rank from the Orient and the Argyle, that's not really at peak until 3 a.m. Okay, so they're moving in at different times. There are, however, many points of intersection where the structural arrangement of venue availability plays a role in pushing individuals and groups of people with different values regarding what is an appropriate set of nightlife behaviours into one another's paths, competing for the same resources, whether that resource is space, access to a taxi, the front of the line to get a drink, whatever that resource is. Now, I call these places of intersection frictions. We would expect altercations to happen at points of friction. There is some evidence to suggest that the sites where the two cultures intersect in this example are indeed those that we're most likely to find what Stephen mentioned as incivility. These are the space between the cruise bar and the Orient. The cruise bar is that large circle on the left, the Orient is the one right next to it. These two venues are only 30 metres apart. Those were the two venues of the descriptions. Another place where we might expect frictions are around the taxi rank and also in the space outside McDonald's, which is open to all comers and thus invites cultural overlap and interpenetration. Note that all of these spaces I've just listed, where we might find issues of altercation and incivility, are all public spaces and beyond the remit of any individual venue. Okay, so we start to see now the incapacity of a venue-centric policy to handle these problems because no venue itself is in charge of these spaces. As it happens, these two cultures of consumption are relatively close to one another in terms of cultural values. Nor are cultures of consumption in general mutually exclusive. A person can easily shift between them simply by taking on a different set of expectations regarding nightlife, a different set of symbolic attachments to the spaces and the objects that circulate in the culture, and by adopting the appropriate rhythms and patterns of consumption, and also adopting the appropriate forms of speech and posture, etc. So we wouldn't expect a high degree of animosity between these two cultural groups, as you might between, say, the rowdy louts and the symphony-going opera buffs who were at the Point 4 hours earlier in the evening. So indeed, this relatively benign situation at Circular Quay, because there is only these two cultures of consumption happening at this time, was demonstrated in the Boscar map of crime of assault locations in Stephen's talk. Attention was focused around King's Cross and Oxford Street, but if anyone cast their eyes up to Circular Quay, and maybe we can show you later, there was just a light spattering of stuff, and it is around that area that I've laid out. Other nightlife precincts obviously do, however, play host to much more abrasively intersecting cultures of consumption. So I'd like now just to take a few moments to gather together the strands of this talk. What we are left with is an understanding of the city after dark as an arrangement of attractants, venues and institutions, and channels and thoroughfares. Inside this patchwork of public and commercial space, various cultures of consumption take part in distinct forms of nightlife. Of particular interest is the transition between time-space layers. If, as suggested, this also means a different array of activities and practices become dominant and a different set of participants emerge within a space. These transitioning periods can entail moments and sites of contestation and tension between variably resourced groups enjoying different levels of official support for the types of activities they'd like to participate in. Now, the acknowledgement of the city after dark as a mobile and dynamic city on the move is firstly an acknowledgement of reality. Placing mobility as a central facet does not seek to replace the more entrenched views that consider nightlife as offering a significant economic and cultural value to a city, or that see it as playing host to problematic cultural behaviours. Acknowledging nightlife as mobile and rhythmic and dynamic merely asks a different set of questions. It illuminates fruitful alternate readings of urban space, grounded in logistical understandings rather than more explicitly moral or economic paradigms. To repeat, it's complementary and it improves the nuance of the other dominant viewpoints through its inclusion. Now, through this lens, different urban sites are identified as significant. We escape some of the reductionist venue centricity. Transportation networks and the nodes at which these networks interface with wider urban spaces become highly significant. Access and competence in regard to mobility infrastructure becomes important. Finally, nocturnal public spaces become important as spaces, not just as the interlinking areas that hold venues apart, reduced to thoroughfare and afterthought. Recognising cultures of consumption as occupying distinct spatio-temporal layers unmasks the complex forms of contestation and negotiation through which these public spaces are made public at all. Thank you, Tassia.
Thank you. We'll just quickly cut to some more interlude 2 from Philip Watts's from field work. We're ready to go? Yeah, go. Okay. King's Cross.
I decided to walk eastward along Darlinghurst Road, taking in the sights and sounds before continuing on my trek throughout the various other streets that make up the area. Walking past the famous Porky's Night Spot and Dream Girl strip clubs, you are invited by a number of doormen, hustlers, marketing agents to check out a show tonight, something that becomes a common theme as your night progresses. Just past these venues is the newly opened Sugar Mill, the latest in exclusive nightclubs that has sprung up in the city. The venue itself, lit only by small spotlights, provides its patrons with an experience of the exclusive, with those lining up being regulated more through the promise of entry than the threat of an imposing security presence. Those who lined up at this time were dressed in a mix of the latest fashions, ranging from the ultra-suggestive to expensive-looking suits. Presumably the cover charge of the venue, as well as strict dress code regulations, enables the venue security staff to restrict entry to those who are not healthy for the venue's brand. The activity only increases as you approach the Town Hall Entertainment Precinct, containing the cinemas, the metro, a number of gaming arcades, and numerous bars and fast food outlets. The density of nighttime venues in this area and the diversity of their function contributes to a vibrant atmosphere. The intensity of neon lights from the arcades and fast food joints really does create the feel of a place where time is irrelevant. It was also interesting to notice a distinct change in fashion from casual and business clothing to more trendy and stylish clothing being worn by males, and definitely more suggestive clothing being worn by females. It was definitely an area in which one's gender was more visibly expressed. Even security in the area tended to display a more hyper-masculine image in the performance of their duties. This could be seen as the bouncers, most with very short or bald heads, openly flirted with potential female patrons and then reassumed their stern approach to males in the same lines. When idle, the security staff would converse amongst each other, arms crossed, and often did not immediately react to someone wishing to enter their venue, but instead continued their own conversations. I guess these types of acts further bolster their authoritative, masculine egos.
Thank you. Our third speaker for this evening is Professor Rob Lynch, who is an academic attached to the School of Leisure, Sport and Tourism at UTS. And Rob has long had a long research interest in popular culture and leisure and a range of associated subjects. And tonight he'll be talking to us on the topic of work and play in the city after dark. So actually paper co-written, I should say, by David Rowe and Rob Lynch.
So thank you, Deborah, and good evening to all. David Williamson's 1980 play, Emerald City, ironically proposes that Sydney is an ideal space for pleasure and leisure, but beset by envy and anxiety. The constant tension over the need to earn enough to survive in and enjoy the city, and for the middle classes to triumph in the status competition for the best urban position, is exacerbated by the restructuring of work and play. The increasing deregulation, flexibility of working hours and the growth of the services sector mean that large numbers of people both produce and consume leisure in the inner city. The central business district in Sydney is close to its principal leisure precincts, simultaneously attracting people as workers, residents and sundry fun seekers. Promoting a vibrant 24-hour city with a thriving nighttime economy is now the norm for anywhere in the world with world city ambitions. But where do workers live and play, and how can they coexist peacefully with others who might want stimulation or slumber at times that suit their diverse life schedules? And how have elements of the nighttime economy emerged and intersected with each other? The complexities and contradictions of a city that never sleeps, staffed by a sleep-deprived, time-poor workforce, need to be better understood by social scientists, planners, local government, police, leisure providers, residents and leisure seekers. Excuse me. Leisure, as we know it, emerged with urbanisation, industrialism and capitalism when work became subject to calculations of time and workers organised, especially through guilds and trade unions, to wrest more time for recreation from their employers. As working days and weeks were reduced, a more solid structure of work, leisure time and space emerged. In broad terms, 9 to 5 work and evening leisure, and the weekend, first 1 day, then 2, devoted to leisure and recreation. This orderly arrangement was accompanied by increasing suburbanisation across the 20th century, with growing cities radiating out towards and the development of owner-occupied houses managed primarily by non- or part-time working women in its middle decades. Leisure at this time was mainly restricted to amateur, home and neighbourhood-centred pastimes, often gender segregated. Television was just beginning to reconstruct the home as a site of entertainment, and leisure outings to the city and its amusements occurred within relatively limited timeframes. The experience of eating out and of even bringing home cooked food was something of a treat, often reserved for birthdays and other ritual life events. It's possible to exaggerate the Stepford-wise orderliness of this time. It is very much an image of Anglo middle-class leisure, but it is nonetheless recognisable as a substantial element within post-World War II Australia. These arrangements, which predominated for a relatively short time and tended to be disrupted by wars, recessions and social upheavals, they began to change as wider transformations occurred. The nature of work was also changing, especially the rise of the service and information sectors that are much more task than time-oriented, and forms of post-Fordist continuous production operating on just-in-time schedules accompanying a deregulation of work, and so too leisure hours. The leisure industry, which had grown to capitalise on the surplus time and money of the population, also began to change. Television viewing was well installed as the principal domestic leisure pursuit. Later, computer games and internet-based leisure, and ironically in the context of this term, fear of violence on the street, would reinforce the home as a sophisticated site for leisure. But leisure outside the home also became of increasing importance, from the multiplex cinema and the games parlour to the late-night coffee bar and the all-night bar. According to the ABS, by 2007, an estimated 3 million, or 22% of Australians aged 15 and over, were involved in some form of paid or unpaid work relating to the selected culture and leisure activities. The picture of employment here is a mixed one, but it's revealing how many people work at leisure, but for only modest financial reward and often for no reward at all. If the range of work activities associated with culture and leisure were to be expanded, then even allowing for sectoral, subsectoral and geographic variations, it's clear that the city is a leisure magnet, but there's considerable fluidity in what counts as work or play. A metropolis like Sydney emerges as a complex fabric of work and leisure flows and activities. There are clusters dominated by hospitality, cultural facilities dedicated to exhibition and performance, in which people are implicated in different ways, such as underemployed workers with time on their hands or overworked people seeking leisure whenever and wherever they can find it. 9 to 5ers coming into the city for scheduled nights out, and residents sharing their place of domicile and recreation with each new influx of fun seekers. There is therefore an increasing tension between people as workers, leisure seekers and residents either with or without a home. There have also been some dramatic social and cultural changes over the past 3 to 4 decades which impact on the topic in question. Delayed age of marriage and childbirth, along with different forms of intimate partnerships, are trends which have produced what is arguably more searching, exploratory behaviour for members of the relatively uncommitted under 30 generation. The divorce rate has increased dramatically, single-parent homes have increased, and young people living at home has become more the norm. There's been an information technology revolution producing technologies beyond the landline telephone and the television that didn't exist prior to 1980, and the ubiquity of mobile phone and text messaging communication facilitates an ebb and flow of groupings around the city not possible to the same extent prior to this technology. The structure of the working week and patterns of working hours have changed, and patterns of city living, particularly in Sydney, have also been overhauled by various local, state and federal government initiatives over the past 2 to 3 decades. These social, cultural and technological changes have each had their effect on the nighttime economy of the city. There's arguably been an erosion of social, spatial and temporal boundaries between the worker, the leisure seeker and the resident, which gives to the 21st century life an openness and complexity that is unprecedented, but also creates the conditions for more intensive competition for the uses and meanings the city as a workplace, playground and home. With this broad brush background to changes to work, leisure in the city and its social and cultural life over the past few decades, we now examine in more detail some of the trends of key importance here. Firstly, changes to the working week. Work and leisure have been historically linked since the Industrial Revolution, and the length, structure and patterns of participation in the working week have a direct effect on the consumption and provision of leisure. We look first at some general data on the working week in Australia. There's been a slight decline in average weekly hours worked by all Australian workers over the past 2 decades. The decline in average hours is a result of strong growth in part-time employment compared with full-time, and has occurred despite increases in average hours worked by both full and part-time workers. Strong growth in part-time employment for both men and in particular women has increased the proportion of workers working fewer hours, resulting in a slight decline in the overall average hours per week. The availability of work is obviously changing in the current economic climate, but nevertheless a medium-term trend towards an increase in part-time work is clear. The conclusions to be drawn from the working hours data are that an increasing number of time-poor but financially well-off workers are putting in 50 hours or more a week at work, some 35% of workers. An increasing number of part-time employees are working less than 35 hours of a standard working week. Although the latter group may not be cashed up, the increased workforce of part-time employees have time on their hands and a flexibility of leisure hours in which to consume their discretionary pleasures. There are also changes to the workforce and the residential population of the City of Sydney that are commented on here. Whatever recent movement the City of Sydney has made towards being a successful 24-hour city, the City of Sydney Council and its implementation of the 1994 Living City, a Blueprint for Sydney plan should be given appropriate credit. The City Council's Living City vision was based upon several principles, including that Sydney should be a multi-use city with a wide range of activities and opportunities. It needed a critical mass of residents, and it needed to be a 24-hour vibrant city. And in retrospect, we can have a look at some of the effects of that Living City planning framework introduced in 1993-94. The workforce, in 1991, the workforce population in the Central Business District was 202,000. In 2000, it was 248,000. The residential population in 1991 was 7,281. In 2000, it was 25,975, which is a 350% increase. These significant increases in residential and workforce population since the early 1900s have undoubtedly had their effect on Sydney as a 24-hour lively city in terms of additional services, spending, infrastructure, and sheer numbers of people on the streets after dark. As a result of increased part-time work patterns, these people are also on the streets for periods of time other than the residual time slots surrounding traditional working hours. The next section is on youth culture in the city. The concept of youth culture is admittedly a fuzzy one, but the activities of youth represent a definite dynamic in the city, and in particularly in the city at night. Let's take, for example, the activities of dance parties, drinking, live music, hanging out, graffiti and skateboarding. With the possible exception of live music, each of these activities occupies a privileged place within youth culture, and each also exists at the margins of conventional morality and in some instances outside the law. For youth, the city is a place of electronically surveilled public spaces, but spaces unsurveilled by the suspicious curtained eyes of the suburban citizen. It is a place of people and public transport leading in and out, of conviviality, of shops, of opportunity and options, of public houses, fast food and openings for what might come next. It's a place of concrete shapes and skatable structures, of hidden but accessible spaces. All the while with people moving nearby, walking past, standing, gathering, providing a flexible base for anonymity or conviviality should either be desired. To go from the youth culture, I'm now moving to the rave scene. As an example of the dynamic which youth inject into the city, we take the so-called rave subculture in Sydney as a case study. Rave subculture refers to warehouse-type parties where groups of young people gather in sites which are not usually used for musical performance. and there they listen and dance to electronic dance music replayed by disc jockeys into the early hours of the weekend mornings. Unlike other musical subcultures already established in Sydney, which usually take place in formal, regulated environments, such as concerts or pubs, nightclubs, the rave party sites in Sydney in the 1980s and 90s included old warehouses, factories and gymnasiums, and in this case at the back of a factory near a fast food outlet. These are not the usual sites for dance or music performances. As Chan asserts, it's more the combination of the venue, the music and the people that creates the meanings of dance events rather than the music itself. The offbeat venues represent another string to the subversive bows sought by youth subcultures. Continuing on this subversive theme, rave culture as a phenomenon of the late 1980s and 1990s attempted to invert the traditional tropes of rock and roll authenticity. Replaying and remixing already recorded music became live music, and DJs, producers and remixers and dancers themselves began to occupy the creating cutting edge of the disc culture. Dance parties in Sydney grew and diversified throughout the 1990s and were also associated in the media with youth deviance and drug use. The tragic ecstasy-related death in 1995 of teenager Anna Woods at a dance party resulted in dramatic alterations to the rave subculture and its spaces. The New South Wales Labor government initially responded to the panic following this tragic death by attempting to close the Phoenician Club, which Anna Woods had attended on the night of her death, and subsequent to this, a crackdown on rave events in general. Following from this, the Carr government of the time also tabled legislation aimed at governing and restricting the freedoms of young people, such as the Summary Offences Bill and an amendment to a 1994 graffiti bill. As the hysteria died down surrounding the evils of rave, a new approach could be seen to emerge, which was beyond suppression and control. This approach is evident in the 1997 Code of Practice for Dance Parties. This code, unlike previous approaches, recognises the inability of the government to stamp out illegal drug use at parties and instead aims to make it safer for people who are taking drugs. Safety requirements in this code, such as the ability to freely obtain drinkable water, were applauded. Through this example of rave, it's possible to assess the dynamic and the impact of a part of youth culture on the wider society, its rhythms and spaces. Old city sites have been mowed over into semi-regulated performance spaces. Youth have gathered in these spaces to express their difference and their new identity, and in some instances with great tragedy, to partake of illegal substances. The resources of the media and the city and local and state governments have been brought into play and reacted first to deal a heavy hand and then to reconsider and lift this hand to facilitate a greater degree of tolerance and safety for the youth of the city in their quest for a particular kind of leisure. The next section is on the live music scene in Sydney. Can I go back? The live music scene in Sydney, it's not only the province of the young, but it's also instructive for our purposes. As Gibson and Homan outlined, since the late 70s, the suburban rock pub has been identified as the authentic site of engagement between Australian bands and pub rock audiences, encapsulated in the Oz rock tradition. The rough-edged Australian pub rock experience has served to distinguish local bands in the global market. For groups such as Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, there'll be a few people here who remember Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, Midnight Oil, Cold Chisel, AC/DC, INXS and Silverchair. Since the period of the 1970s and 80s, there's been a significant reduction in live music venues in New South Wales, particularly in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. In a significant number of venue closures or losses, live music operations have been displaced by gaming facilities, poker machines. In 1997, the New South Wales Government legalised the installation of poker machines in the state's hotels, and gaming profits jumped by 39% from 1998 to 1999. A 1999 Musicians Union study found that 67% of musicians surveyed had experienced a decline in live music work. In 2003, Homan, research in this area, quotes a conversation with a hotelier who was responding to a question as to why he didn't have live music in his pub. The hotelier said, "What's the point? We just need one person to complain about the noise levels and we can get shut down. We'd rather have 10 poker machines, put in strippers twice a week, and we're doing very well." However, Johnson and Homan point out that the causes of the reduction of live music spaces extend beyond the liberalisation of gaming legislation, so it's not just the poker machines that have led to that particular decline. The live music scene in Sydney, similar to the rave music scene, highlights a complex web of interactions around the nighttime economy. Different forms of leisure compete and conflict with each other. Legal frameworks are altered to suit the arguments of the day. The state's finances through gambling tax revenues come into play. The hotel industry secures the influence to gamble in the same arena as the club industry, and the live music scene is forced into a reinventive phase. The hotel industry at the centre of this process is itself another key story in the nighttime leisure economy of the city. Now, there are several other considerations of this project which are underway and would be a part of this consideration of leisure in this project. One is events like the Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras. We see like a transformation of the city streets into quite something different for the period of that festival. The same with big festivals like New Year's Eve events, homecomings for successful sporting teams who've been overseas and such matters, where again the city streets and public spaces are transformed into quite something from what they usually are. Drinking and the hotel industry is obviously a central part of the kind of leisure sphere of this particular culture, and as the previous speakers have both indicated, it's really quite a focus of this research. Sydney has a number of leisure precincts, specifically built leisure precincts, some adapted as leisure precincts, and for the most part they do the job that they were designed for reasonably well. And so each of these precincts, here the Rocks, Haymarket, Chinatown area, the Taylor Square, each will need to come under some investigation. And missing thus far is so-called high culture, the realm of museums in which we're privileged to be here tonight, of opera and theatre, drama. This is also another central part of the city's leisure culture and operates right alongside all of these other forms of popular culture, and I think there's a dynamic to be worked through there as well. To conclude and summarise the issues raised in this paper, the nighttime leisure economy of Sydney is contained within and affected by the wider social and cultural changes which have occurred in Australian society over the past few decades: social, cultural, spatial, technological and legal. In a direct attempt to stimulate change and add to the liveliness of the Sydney City Council implemented an expansion program which increased both the residential and the commercial populations of the city over a relatively short time frame leading up to 2000. The residential population of the city increased by 350% between 1991 and 2000, and it's interesting that of those people, some 76% of those new residents are renters, indicating a highly mobile group of people in the city spaces. The new workforce in the city in this period increased by 23% to a population of 250,000, and some 35 to 40% whom work part-time hours and spill out over into the city's spaces at irregular non-standard hours. Major events in the city such as New Year's Eve, the Festival of Sydney opening, the Mardi Gras or sporting team homecomings temporarily transform the city's spaces in Bakhtinian carnival style, opening the city and its spaces to other possibilities. The city leisure precincts, Starling Harbour, Fox Studios, the Rocks, Chinatown, Oxford Street, George Street multiplexes and others, for the most part, accommodate the freewheeling activity anticipated of such spaces. Other spaces such as warehouses, footpaths, parks, town hall steps, laneways and forecourts Forecourts are sought out by those who seek something less formal, less commercial, less organised, less surveilled in their leisure gatherings. Youth and other subcultures seek out their differences, sometimes subversively, sometimes legally, and sometimes not. There are conflicts, disagreements among drinkers, residents, dancers, revellers, theatre-goers, museum-goers, police, security officers, paramedics, commercial organisations and the state, all around competing interests of leisure, residential and commercial desires. The resources of local and state governments are brought into play, both to develop spaces and opportunities to enhance leisure amenity in the city and to regulate to allow competing interests to coexist. But against the regular differing of the interests, the conflicts which emerge are resolved for the most part with a minimum of violence. The nighttime economy and leisure pursuits of the city are complex, fluid and in constant evolution. In conclusion, we make the observation that this evolution of leisure and the accompanying tensions, conflict and resolutions are valuable components of a democratic and open society. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. If the panellists would like to take a seat along the front there.